Hello, my name is Bill McNally. Welcome to America's Future. My guest today is James Perloff. He is a freelance writer based in Boston, Massachusetts. He is a contributor to The New American and WorldNetDaily.com. His first book, The Shadows of Power, an expose of private influence on American foreign policy, sold over 100,000 copies. His most recent books, Tornado in a Junkyard and The Case Against Darwin, are layman-level discussions of the growing scientific case against Darwin's theory of evolution. Mr. Perloff is noted in Who's Who in America and has been a guest on well over 100 radio and television programs to discuss both history and the creation-evolution debate. Welcome to Windham, New Hampshire, Mr. Perloff.
Well, nice to be here.
Thank you for coming. Well, let's start with the basics here. Why is the subject of evolution relevant? Is it more than just a science matter?
Yes, it is. You know, a lot of people think, well, hey, you're talking about something like it's like physics and chemistry, right? So this must be a pretty boring topic. But actually, Bill, it's very relevant, the theory of evolution. And you're a Christian, and I am. And you know, when you send your kids to church, they hear a certain explanation for life. They hear that God created all life forms, and that God created them in His image with a purpose for their lives. On the other hand, you go to public school or college and you hear the theory of evolution and you're taught a very different story. You hear that far from being created by God, all life forms were created by chance in a primordial soup billions of years ago, and man is not created in the image of God at all, but man simply evolved from ape-like ancestors through natural selection and survival of the fittest. Now, if you're a normal kid, you're going to start to ask yourself a question, which is, okay, who's right? Is my pastor right at church, or is the science teacher right? For a lot of kids, they start to say, hey, that stuff I heard back in church is just a bunch of junk. I mean, science is established through the scientific method, right? So it must be true. And a lot of people actually wind up becoming atheists, and I'm a perfect example of that, as a result of being taught the theory of evolution. Not only me, but you could take a lot of famous examples. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, started out as a Christian theology student. Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, was a Christian originally. After reading the works of Darwin, he became an atheist. The kid in the news not too long ago, Darrell Lambert, threatened with expulsion from the Boy Scouts for being an atheist, taught theory of evolution like I was in public school, became an atheist as a result. We could also detail the impact on culture. Now, this is a book that came out just recently. It's called From Darwin to Hitler. Professor Richard Weikart is a professor of European history at California State University, and he's documented the influence of Darwinian teachings on Nazi race policy. Of course, Darwin was a eugenicist. He thought you could transform mankind through selective breeding, and that's what Hitler was trying to do. So in a nutshell, this is not just a dry science topic. Evolution has had a tremendous impact on how we view ourselves, whether or not we believe in God, and it's had a great impact on our culture as well.
Don't evolutionists claim that evolution is a proven fact? So what does the theory of evolution say?
Yeah, absolutely. They say it's a fact. In fact, if you go to a public school now or a college and say you don't believe in evolution, believe in creation, they'll laugh in your face. They'll say, what's wrong with you? I mean, when you're born in a barn, everybody believes in evolution, proven to be a fact 100 years ago. It's taught at Harvard, all our schools, all scientists accept it. So who are you? What do you know more than all those science PhDs? We probably believe the earth is flat too. That's a very typical response that you might get. But the fact of the matter is that there's a tremendous body of scientific evidence against evolution, and that's what I talk about in my books and my lectures. But as to your second question, what does the theory of evolution say? I don't know if we can have the cameras focus in on this little graphic here, the evolutionary sequence. But what's basically taught is that life started in a primordial soup as single-celled ancestors, bacteria, billions of years ago, and then these started evolving, and they developed from one cell to two cell to three cell. In other words, they became multicellular creatures, and they kept on evolving until they became seagoing invertebrates like jellyfish. And then the invertebrates evolved into fish, and the fish yearned to come on shore, and their fins began evolving into arms and legs, and they became the first amphibians, which are creatures that can go on land or sea like in a frog. Then the amphibians evolved into reptiles into mammals, and within the class of mammals, we eventually had these ape-like creatures who became people. And that's the theory of evolution in a nutshell.
Okay. In your lectures, you discuss 4 areas of scientific evidence that refute the theory of evolution. What are those?
Okay. First of all, we talk about genetics, and second, we talk about the origin of life, and then we also talk about something called irreducible complexity, And we'll go into each of these as we have time today. And finally, we talk about something called transitional forms.
Okay. Well, let's start with genetics. How does the genetics refute the theory of evolution?
Okay. Well, a good question to ask an evolutionist, and I don't know if we can again look at that little graphic of the evolutionary sequence, but a good question to ask an evolutionist is, okay, if evolution is true, how did a fish get the genes to become a human being? Now, granted, we share some genes with animals, but the gene pool of a fish is drastically different from that of a human being. Now, with the discovery of genetics, there was actually initially resistance from the Darwinian community. Darwin had thought that animals just have an unlimited capacity to adapt to their environment. With the discovery of genetics, they suddenly realized no animal could make any adaptation unless it first had the genes for it. You know, we can't be anything physically our genes won't allow us to be. So they were stumped for a while by this dilemma. How did the fish get the genes to become a human being? The solution they came up with was mutations. Now, we've all heard of mutations. They're rare events, but they involve a sudden change in a gene, a sudden change in genetic information. So the modern theory of evolution, the theory that's taught today, says, how did the fish get the genes to become a human being? Simple. He mutated the genes. Hundreds of millions of years ago, some fish got a mutation that gave a little bit of an arm or a leg. Then another mutation came along that was added to the gene pool. And so over millions of years, the fish mutated into a human being. But you know what? That theory doesn't hold up any longer. This book was recently published by Dr. Lee Spetner, who taught information theory for 10 years at Johns Hopkins. It's called Not by Chance, Shattering the Modern Theory of Evolution. And in this book, Dr. Spetner, who spent years studying mutations on a molecular level, points out that mutations always delete information from the genetic code. They don't add function to an animal, they delete function. And you know, that agrees with what we can observe, because what are mutations causing human beings? Sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Down syndrome, and about 4,000 other genetic diseases. Even the so-called beneficial mutations that evolutionists like to point out, such as mutations creating antibiotic resistance in bacteria, are demonstrated by Dr. Spetner to involve losses of genetic information. They always do. And you might call that strike one on Darwin's theory of evolution.
All right. How about the origins of life then?
Well, if you open up a public school life sciences textbook today, it'll say the life began in the ancient ocean about 3 billion years ago, when by chance chemicals and amino acids formed the first living cell, and all life proceeded from that. Well, in Darwin's day, that might have been justifiable. You know, Darwin got this idea going in his book, The Origin of Species. He talked about how life began in a warm little pond, and he talked about the chemicals that might have formed that first cell. In his day, they thought, hey, cells are tiny. Tiny means simple. But now we know cells are anything but simple. I'll give you a quote here. Quote, a simple one-celled bacterium, or E. coli, contains DNA information units that are the equivalent of 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Unquote. Now that quote is from the Encyclopedia Britannica. See, cells are not simple. They're founded, they consist basically of proteins, and there's thousands of different proteins, even in a so-called simple bacterial cell. And the proteins, in turn, have a smaller building block called amino acids, and there's hundreds in one protein. They have to be in the exact sequence for the protein to function. Plus, you need the genetic code for a cell to function. You need translation devices to translate that code, because it's a language like any other language. You need a cell membrane to ingest nutrients and expel waste. And if you think about it, this first little cell of Darwin's, which supposedly came about by chance, it must have been quite a cell, because before it died, it must have completely developed and perfected the process of cellular reproduction, because if it didn't, there never would have been a second cell, and Darwin's evolutionary process would have stopped right there. The point we're making, Bill, is that cells are far too complex to have originated by chance.
You know, an interesting paragraph, and you touch on this subject, is irreducible complexity. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Dr. Michael Behe is a biochemist down at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He's written this book called Darwin's Black Box. Now, in this box, he does describe something called irreducible complexity. What he means by that is that in the cell, or in organisms and human beings, there are certain systems that are so complex, and they involve many interdependent parts. You know, if you take away one of those parts, or just two of those parts, the whole system can't function. So he says it's therefore impossible for it to have evolved step by step. Now, what I just said sounds pretty abstract, so let me give an example that he gives. The blood clotting system. You know, when we get a cut, Bill, and our finger bleeds, what stops it? The body forms a blood clot. Now, to the naked eye, a blood clot might look very simple, but to a biochemist like Behe looking through a microscope, it's a very complex process. It takes well over a dozen steps to form a blood clot. A person with the disease hemophilia, which is a mutational disorder, is missing just one clotting factor. Now, he's at high risk for bleeding. If you're missing 2 or 3 factors, you've got no chance for survival at all. You'll definitely bleed to death. So the point Dr. Behe makes is this. How can blood clotting have evolved? In the Darwinian evolutionary model, it would have evolved over millions of years, step by step, as new chance mutations introduced each step. But that can't be. You know, 3 steps don't do you any good. 6 steps, 10 steps don't do you any good. You'll bleed to death. And if you bled to death, how could creatures pass these incremental stages on to the next generation? So it's impossible for blood clotting to have evolved. And Dr. B goes on to show that the human immune system, human vision, and other systems are irreducibly complex. And he's not a Bible beater. He doesn't say this makes the book of Genesis right. He just says, from his perspective as a biochemist, it's impossible for these systems to have evolved, according to the Darwinian theory of evolution.
What about the transitional forms?
What we mean by transitional forms, again, if we could focus on that graphic of the evolutionary sequence, again, Darwin's theory says we went from single-celled organisms to invertebrates to fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals. Now, if that's true, there should be innumerable transitional forms between each one. You know, just to go from, think about it, to go from a fish to a land animal, you wouldn't have to just evolve bones, the right bones for your arms. You have to evolve the right set of muscles. You have to simultaneously mutate a whole new nervous system. And by the way, while this fish was coming on shore, you have to mutate a whole new breathing system. So, as you can imagine, in the trial and error stage, there'd be an incredible number of in-between forms. In fact, Darwin himself predicted that the number would be inconceivably great. So do we find evidence for those transitional forms? Now, there's 3 places, Bill, where we can look for that evidence. One is in the living world around us, of course. And the science that classifies the living world is called taxonomy. And it was founded by a guy named Carolus Linnaeus. He's the one who started calling animals by genus and species and class and order. And that's the system we use today to classify life with some modifications. Now, Linnaeus was dead against the theory of evolution. Why? Because when he classified the living world, he saw it was split into distinct divisions, no overlaps. And that's what we see today. When we look, we see single-celled organisms, and we see amphibians and fish and reptiles, invertebrates in the ocean, but nothing in between. So how do evolutionists explain this? They say, well, they all became extinct. Well, how could they all become extinct? Because the whole reason the creature evolved in the first place is it was supposedly so superior to the form that came before it. And by the way, we also have to ask is, why aren't these creatures evolving into each other today? For example, why aren't bacteria evolving into the marine invertebrates today? You know, according to the theory of evolution, we started with 1-celled ancestors who became 2-celled, 3-celled, 4-celled, 5-celled. But you know what, Bill? There's no such thing in the living world as a 2-celled living creature or 3-celled or 4-celled or 5-celled. In fact, according to Alan H. Linton, Professor Emeritus of Bacteriology at the University of Bristol over in England, we've never even seen one species of bacteria change into another species of bacteria. Yet, according to evolution, bacteria evolved all the way into human beings. So at the living world, no evidence.
I don't know if you covered them all. Is there any place else we can look for transitional forms?
Absolutely. Another place would be the fossil record, right? The fossil record would be the best evidence of what ancient life looked like on the Earth. So if you look in the fossil record, we find these transitional forms. Well, if you go down to Cambrian rock, the very low geologic layer has most of the oldest known invertebrate fossils. You can find billions of invertebrate fossils. But how many fossils are there that show they came from a common ancestor or from bacteria or even how they evolved? There's none. Let me quote Stephen Jay Gould. The late Dr. Gould was the leading American spokesperson for evolution in this country before his recent death. He said this, quote, "Our more extensive labor has still failed to identify any creature that might serve as a plausible ancestor for the Cambrian faunas," unquote. Faunas meaning animals. There's not a single specimen in the living world, not a single example in the fossil world. If you take the next step from the invertebrates to fish, Professor Tracy Storer, professor of zoology at the University of California, has pointed out there's not a single example in the fossil record of transitions between invertebrates and fish. So the missing links are missing. They're missing in the living world and also in the fossil world.
I understand that some proofs of evolution have been discredited. Can you shed some light on some of those?
Sure. This is something we also talk about in my lectures and in my books. If we can concentrate on the second graphic here, it's a picture of embryos. Now, these are drawings that I was shown when I went to Lexington Public Schools in Lexington, Mass. as proof for the theory of evolution. They allege to show the growing embryos of, from left to right, as a hog, a calf, a rabbit, and a human. And if you look at the top, they're indistinguishable. And the guy who made these was a Darwinist named Ernst Haeckel. And he said that since you can't distinguish animal embryos from human embryos, this proves we all have a common ancestor. And he said it validated the theory of evolution. But what most people don't know is those pictures are actually fakes. They're exposed as fakes way back in 1919 in a book called Haeckel's Frauds and Forgeries. But more recently, there's an embryologist at St. George's Medical School in London named Dr. Michael Richardson, and Dr. Richardson found there was no evidence that anybody ever systematically checked Haeckel's claims to see if they're really true or not. So he assembled a scientific team that did just that. They photographed the growing embryos of 39 different species, and let me just quote what Dr. Richardson said in a 1997 interview with London's The Times. Here's what he said, quote, "This, speaking of these embryo pictures, this is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It's shocking to find that somebody one thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. It makes me angry. What Haeckel did was to take a human embryo and copy it, pretending that the salamander and the pig and all the others look the same at the same stage of development. They don't. These are fakes," unquote. Yet, unfortunately, many of these pictures still appear in college textbooks today and in high school biology textbooks, although they're slowly being withdrawn. I should mention other areas that have been discredited. When I went to school, we were told our body had these vestigial organs. These are useless organs. We said they have no function for you. They serve some purpose for your animal ancestors in the past. Well, 100 years ago, less than that actually, Horatio Hackett Newman, a leading evolutionist, said there were no less than 180 vestigial useless organs in the human body. You know what they were saying were vestigial at that time? They said the thyroid gland was a useless organ. Now, of course, we know it's got a great role in metabolism. Mm-hmm. They said that the pineal gland found in your brain had no function. Now we know it secretes the hormone melatonin. They said that the thymus gland found in your chest was vestigial, no function. Now we know it has an immune system function. In other words, evolutionists simply assumed if the function of an organ hadn't been discovered, had no function, and thus proved Darwin's theory of evolution that we were loaded with these useless relics from our animal past. But now the list of 180 useless organs is down to about 0. Another one was salt in the blood. When I went to Lexington Public Schools, our teacher said, you've got the exact same percentage of salt in your blood as exists in the seawater. And he said that proves we evolved from sea creatures. And hey, for me, a little Darwinist in the making, I thought, wow, one more nail in the coffin that shows Darwin is right. It's totally not true. You can look at any of the elements that you can find in both seawater and in your blood, and they're in very different percentages. And I've laid that out in my book, 1,000 to 1, 250 to 1. But there are no elements that exist in the same percentage in your blood as in seawater. Now, a lot of these rumors still exist in the public mind, but they've been discredited, and people need to find out about these.
Then, in light of the evidence then against it, why do so many people accept evolution?
Bill, I think there's essentially 2 reasons for that. One is that they've never been exposed to any of the criticism of evolutionary theory. A lot of these guys going to public school or colleges are only taught the theory of evolution, and so that's all they ever hear. And it's like if you're in a courtroom and all you heard was the prosecutor or the defendant, you'd think he was right until you heard the other side of the story. Most people have never heard the other side of the story. There's another reason, though, Bill, why the theory of evolution persists despite the evidence against it, and that is for a number of people, and this included me when I was much younger. A lot of people don't want to be accountable to God. So when a theory comes along that says, hey, we can explain life without God, they're very quick to accept that. That's the other reason why this theory hangs on, whereas in another field branch of science, if the evidence was against it, it would have been dropped a long time ago.
All right, we're about halfway through. Why don't we talk about your books here? Let me make a couple of points of interest that I liked. The artwork and cover for this book, Tornado in a Junkyard, was done by a sitting member of the New Hampshire legislature, the Honorable Paul Ingbertson. And a second note that I liked was the actor Jack Lemmon. He played the role of Clarence Darrow in the 1990 film version of Inherit the Wind. And he says, my congratulations to Mr. Perloff for an outstanding piece of work. Let's talk about these 2 books and tell us, the background on them.
Sure. Well, Tornado in a Junkyard, which we have on display here at the table, is a book that deals with this topic of creation versus evolution in depth. And it does. The reason Jack Lemmon actually wrote us those nice comments, he'd been in Inherit the Wind, which, of course, purports to show what happened in the Scopes trial. But the film Inherit the Wind is actually a gross distortion of what happened in the Scopes trial. For example, as you probably know, John Scopes was a school teacher in Tennessee, charged with violating the Butler Act, which forbade teaching that man came from a lower ancestor. Well, in the movie, he's portrayed as a martyr. He's in prison, but in real life, he never even taught biology. He was just a substitute math teacher who happened to teach biology one day. Actually, he said in his memoirs he never actually taught any evolution, but he was hired by the ACLU as a test case to challenge the Butler Act in Tennessee, but he was never a martyr. And in the film version, William Jennings Bryan, who took the side of the Bible and creation in the courtroom, is portrayed as an ignorant bigot who's against science. And he says in the film, science is the way of darkness. But what he actually said in the courtroom was that mankind is indebted to science for all the advances that it's made. In my book, Tornado in a Junkyard, I have a chapter on the Scopes trial in which I take the movie script and I compare it side by side with the actual court transcript, and you see it's about 180 degrees opposite of what happened as you watch the movie. So that was what Mr. Lemon had starred in that movie, the most recent TV version, and he made very nice comments about the book before he passed away.
Right. What about this one here, the case against Darwin? This is why the evidence should be examined.
The case against Darwin is a quick read. You know, Tornado in the Junkyard is 300 pages long, pretty fine print. If you don't have time for a book like that, the case against Darwin summarizes the evidence against Darwinism, kind of like we've been doing here, or as I give it. It's basically a transcript of what I say when I give about a 1-hour talk. So you can read that in about an hour. If you haven't got time for a full-length book, but you just want to get a grasp on some of the details we've been going over today about what Dr. B called irreducible complexity, the lack of transitional forms, the difficulty of chemicals forming a cell by chance, those kind of things, those are in the book, The Case Against Darwin. I should mention, Bill, that you can get those books very easily. People can order them through Amazon.com, at your local bookstore. Barnes & Noble stocks them, and they're very easy to get hold of.
Very good. There's some interesting parts in here about we hear about the monkey and the typewriter. You know, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, you know, that actually originated back in the year 1860 at Oxford University. There was a big debate that year. It was the year after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. There was a debate that year between Samuel Wilberforce, who was defending the Bible and creation, and Professor Thomas Huxley. Now, Huxley was one of Darwin's best friends. He was called Darwin's bulldog because he was the fiercest advocate of Darwinism in the 19th century. And so it was a big debate. And Wilberforce defended creation by using what he called the design argument. You know, this is well known to clergymen at that time. He said, you know, if you're walking in the forest and you stumble across a stone, well, maybe that stone got there by chance. But you keep on walking, you find a watch. You can tell by looking at a watch that somebody designed it. It didn't just get there by chance. And or you know, another example would be Mount Rushmore. You know, if you're in a modern context, if you're out at Mount Rushmore, even an evolutionist would agree that chance processes like wind and rain and erosion and birds pecking would not form the Mount Rushmore monument. It's just too well designed. So the argument is design proves a designer. So how did Thomas Huxley, the evolutionist, answer that argument? He said to Wilberforce, he said, "Well, Reverend Wilberforce, it's all well and good." He said, "But I put it to you, sir, if we were to take 6 monkeys and equip them with six typewriters that randomly poke at the keys, why, if we gave them but enough millions of years, they would produce every book in the British Museum." Well, evolutionists really like that argument about the monkey at the typewriters, and I was given that argument in Lexington Public Schools by my teacher. He said, you know, if you had a room full of monkeys and the monkeys were to randomly poke at typewriters, that eventually, if you gave them enough time, produced the complete works of Shakespeare. His point was that if time and chance could produce the works of Shakespeare, time and chance could also produce something as complex as a cell. But you know what we should have said? If we were really smart students, we should have said, hey, wait a minute, teach. What are the odds of that happening? Because never mind the works of Shakespeare, what are the odds of a monkey typing one pre-selected 9-letter word, such as the word evolution? We'll give Huxley a break. We'll say the typewriter only has the 26 letters of the alphabet, no other symbols. Well, to get the E would be a piece of cake, right? I mean, to get the E would be 1 in 26, so get the E in no time. But to get the word evolution, now we're talking about 26 to the power of 9. Take that monkey on average more than 5 trillion attempts to type the word evolution once correctly. If you type at a pace of 10 letters a minute, that would take him more than 1 million years. Now, to get 2 consecutive pre-selected words, such as the phrase evolution commenced, would take the monkey more than 1 billion times 1 billion years. Now, bear in mind, the Big Bang only happened about 15 billion years ago, according to Big Bang cosmologists. So if a monkey started typing at the start of the Big Bang until now, he couldn't get you the 2-word phrase evolution commenced, let alone the works of Shakespeare. And of course, if time and chance could not produce a 2-word phrase such as evolution commenced, it could not produce something as complex as a cell or the genetic code. But that is an argument, another one of those arguments that persisted without critical examination being done.
I think you mentioned in the book, correct me if I'm not mistaken, about the amount of evidence that, how much physical evidence actually exists for what they call evolution, something about enough that would only fill a small table or something like that.
I think we have a quote in there about from a paleontologist that the evidence, fossil evidence for human evolution would only fill a coffin. Another paleontologist said it would barely cover a billiard table. But in terms of lack of evidence, there's one area, we were talking about transitional forms earlier, there's one area I didn't actually go into. Michael Denton is an Australian molecular biologist. He's written this book called Evolution: A Theory in Crisis. Again, if we can focus on the evolutionary sequence, Dr. Denton noted the sequence that Darwinism had claimed, going from bacterial cell to invertebrate to fish to amphibian to reptile to mammal. So he examined those creatures on a molecular level to see if you could establish that sequence. And what he found that when you study the cells of an amphibian on a molecular level, they're just as distinct from fish as humans are. In other words, on a molecular level, fish are not the close cousins of amphibians, as Darwin's theory claims.
In your lectures, what's the most often question that you get from people?
The one I hear the most is that Darwin recanted his views. There is a story that's gone around that on his deathbed, Darwin repented and became a Christian and denied his own evolutionary theory. That story has been investigated and found to be apocryphal, but especially when I'm speaking to churches, a lot of people have heard that rumor, and that comes up quite often, but that's considered to be not a true story.
Well, Mr. Perloff, I really thank you for coming and sharing the information here today. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the town of Windham for the studios, the volunteers, and the staff, and thank the viewers for watching.